My father was a cartographer, not in the modern sense. He didn't work with satellites or digital renderings or any of the clean, bloodless tools of the contemporary surveyor. He worked with paper and ink and an engineer's transit that was already an antique when he inherited it from his own father. He mapped things nobody else wanted to map. Wetlands, quarry spoils, abandoned rail corridors, the kind of forgotten geography that development companies needed documented before they could legally ignore it. He died 6 years ago, and I've been trying to understand what he found in the last 14 months of his life ever since. He started calling it the Inward Survey. That was his name for the project, never fully explained. The words appearing first in a letter he sent me in October of 2017. I was living in Portland at the time, working in municipal planning, and we spoke maybe once every 2 or 3 weeks. He was based in central Pennsylvania, in the small house outside Clearfield where I'd grown up, and he'd always been a solitary man in a solitary profession. The letter arrived without context or preamble. He wrote, "I have begun the Inward Survey, and I think you would find the early results interesting, though perhaps troubling. I don't want to say more until I know what I have. Love, Dad." I called him that evening, and he deflected with practiced ease, telling me the maps were coming along, that he was eating fine, that the weather had been dry enough to work. I let it go. That was a mistake I've spent 6 years examining. The house came to me after the funeral. He had no debts and almost no possessions of value. What he had in extraordinary abundance was paper. His study, a converted bedroom off the main hallway, contained filing cabinets, flat map drawers, and a long drafting table covered in the technical debris of a working surveyor's life. I spent 4 days going through it before the estate attorney needed my signature on anything, and it was during those 4 days that I found the Inward Survey maps. They were stored not in the flat drawers with his professional work, but in a canvas satchel hung from a hook behind the closet door, as though he'd wanted them within reach but out of sight. There were 11 sheets. I will describe them as accurately as I can, because I have been over them so many times that I've worn soft spots into the paper from handling. The first 4 were recognizable as maps of the land around Clearfield. My father had worked that ground professionally for years and knew it intimately, the topographic lines, the watershed divisions, the old logging roads. What was unusual about these particular sheets was the overlaid notations. He had added in his precise drafting hand a second set of lines that didn't correspond to any physical feature I could identify. They weren't roads or drainage or property boundaries. They were drawn in a slightly lighter ink, and they curved in patterns that made me think of sound waves or the isobars on a weather map, except that they clustered. They congregated around specific points. At each convergence, he had written a 2-letter code and a small asterisk. The codes recurred across all 11 sheets. I counted 12 unique codes total. I wrote them in my notebook. AA, BK, CF, DL, EM, FJ, GG, HN, IR, JQ, KT, LW. I assumed at first that they corresponded to a key somewhere, a legend he'd created and stored separately. I searched the entire study for it. I searched every box and folder and envelope in the house. I never found a key. The later maps in the sequence, sheets 8 through 11, were harder to look at. This is a strange thing to say about technical documents, about lines on paper, but there was something about the density of the markings that made my eyes want to skid away. The overlaid curves had become more numerous, and the convergence points were so tightly clustered in certain areas that the ink had nearly blackened the paper. The 2-letter codes appeared constantly, sometimes 3 or 4 per square inch. And there was something else on these later sheets that wasn't on the earlier ones. He had drawn a boundary line, a single heavy ink line that enclosed a roughly oval area near the center of the last map. Within that oval, he had written nothing. No codes, no topographic data, no labels, just blank paper inside the line. And then at the very edge of the oval, in lettering smaller than anything else on the sheet, "Here the survey cannot continue." I took photographs of all 11 maps. I took photographs of his notes, his field books, every scrap of paper with his handwriting. Then I locked the originals in a safe deposit box, because by that point I had a feeling, formless and uncomfortable, that I should not keep them close. I spent the next 2 years trying to reconstruct what he had been doing. I spoke to his colleagues, to the county planning office, to surveyors who'd worked adjacent to his project areas. No one knew about the inward survey. Several people mentioned that he'd seemed distracted in his final year, less meticulous than usual, apt to wander conversations. His neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Geraldine Marsh, told me he'd started keeping unusual hours. She'd seen lights in his study at 3 and 4 in the morning. She'd seen him, twice, standing in the field behind his property in the middle of the night, holding what she thought was a compass. I found his final field book in the 3rd year of my investigation, misfiled in a box of professional archives I'd initially dismissed as routine. It was a standard green survey field book, his name and a date range written on the cover in marker. The dates ran from March through October of 2018, the final 7 months before his death. The entries in the field book were unlike anything in his professional records. His work notes were always dry and precise. Instrument readings, traverse calculations, weather conditions, elapsed time. These notes were different. They were longer, more personal, and increasingly incoherent as the book progressed. The early entries described fieldwork in locations I could identify from the maps, specific roads, woodlots, creek crossings. He wrote about instrument anomalies, compass deviations, moments where his transit seemed to level differently than the terrain suggested. He wrote, "The instrument is honest. The ground may not be." By July, the entries had changed register. He wrote less about the fieldwork itself and more about what he was perceiving at the convergence points, his term for the locations he'd marked with codes on the maps. He described sounds he couldn't source, a low, irregular tone that seemed to come from beneath the soil. He described visual disturbances, the way the ground appeared to breathe in certain lights. He wrote on July 14th, "I have been measuring the wrong things. I have been measuring surfaces. The survey is about depth." I had to put the field book down for 2 days after I read that sentence. The September entries were the hardest. His handwriting, always so controlled, had begun to show strain. Letters formed correctly, but pressed too hard into the page. Lines that wavered at their ends. He wrote about the codes. He told me, and I am certain now, that these entries were addressed to me, that he knew I'd eventually read them. He told me that the 2-letter codes were not arbitrary, that each one corresponded to something he had identified at the convergence points, something that was, in his word, present. He said he had not yet been able to determine what the 12 presences were, or whether they were aware of being mapped. He said the boundary he'd drawn on the last map, the empty oval, was a place he'd located where the presences were so dense that his instruments stopped functioning. He said he'd stood at the edge of that area 3 times. The 3rd time, he said, he had heard his name spoken by something that was not wind and was not any animal he knew. The last entry was dated October 3rd, 2018. He died on October 17th, heart failure, the certificate said. He was 64 and had no documented cardiac history. The last entry reads, in its entirety, "I understand now that the inward survey was not my project. It was conducted through me. I was the instrument and not the surveyor. The maps are accurate, but I am not able to read them correctly because I was only the means of their creation. I love you. Do not go to the places on the maps. I think they have been waiting a long time, and I think they are patient in a way that we are not built to understand. I was only visiting. You would be staying. I did not go to the places on the maps. I have the maps in the safe deposit box. I have the field book in a fireproof lockbox in my apartment. I work in municipal planning. I read surveys every day. And sometimes when a colleague puts a map on my desk, I find myself looking for the secondary lines, the overlay, the coded convergence points that don't correspond to anything physical. Sometimes I find them. They're different on every map. They're on county surveys, on developer plats, on FEMA flood zone documents that have passed through a dozen official hands. The lines are faint, and they're not in the original files when I check the digital source. They appear only on the printed copies, as though something is annotating the paper after the fact, drawing its secondary geography over whatever we've put there. Last month, I found a convergence point on a routine utility easement survey for a suburb outside of Pittsburgh. I found the code at the center of it. The code was AA, the first one on my father's list. I have not told anyone about this. I have the printed copy in my apartment in a drawer I don't open often. I don't know what I'm waiting for. I think probably I am waiting to understand what my father meant when he said they are patient. I think I am in the process of learning what that kind of patience feels like from the inside. The drawer is locked. I have not lost the key. But twice this week I've stood in front of it at 3 a.m, holding it, not quite sure whether I was about to open it or checking to make sure it was still there. I'm no longer certain which one it was.